Good morning. As most of you know, we moved into our new offices earlier this week. There were many people involved in helping make our transition into our new offices. I'd like to thank Sean Savka, J.R. Trimark, Adam Donald, and Brian Ide for their work on our phone system and networking our computers. I'd also like to thank Bob Martinelli and Joe Mills and Matt Dorman for helping make the move, the actual physical move of our offices go smoothly. But most importantly, I'd like to share with you this morning two wonderful provisions from God over the last couple of weeks. First, we have been looking for new or used office furniture during the last month and had found nothing that met our needs nor our budget until I received a phone call about a week and a half ago. This person in the congregation called me and said that his company had some extra office furniture and asked if we needed any desks for our new offices. I explained to him that we hadn't found anything yet and that I would be interested. We met that afternoon at a warehouse in Illinois and proceeded not only to hand select all of our desks and credenzas, but also all of our desk chairs, guest chairs, our meeting chairs, our conference tables, whiteboards, and many other office items. It was a wonderful provision. And folks, this was a direct result of many who prayed for our needs and a wonderful testimony to God's goodness to this church. But God was not done. Last Saturday, I received another phone call from someone in our congregation whose wife's company was replacing their copier and asked if we needed a copier. I explained to him that we had been experiencing problems with our current copier and that anything would be an improvement. So during our office move on Monday, we stopped by her company and picked up our new and much improved copier. It's been quite a week, and we're just now catching our breath, but we have much to be thankful for. May God receive all the glory and all the praise for all that He has done for us. Thank you for your prayers.
The Federal Reserve stepped in and let a group of banks that infused more money into the company in exchange for control of the company. So, despite the efforts of the best and brightest people, using the best technology, the best money, and establishing the best plans, the company essentially was finished. And it's no small irony that the company went by the name of Long-Term Capital Management. Well, James continues to be very relevant to us today. And there was just no shortage. I could have used any number of modern-day examples, illustrations of the truth of James chapter 4. So again, we want to pay special attention to what James has to say to us today. So far, just an overview of James. We're at the end of chapter 4, and after this we just have one more chapter to go. Let's consider what we've learned so far. James is about how we conduct ourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. If that's the basic truth, the basic idea behind James, we see that played out in many different ways. A couple weeks ago, at the beginning of chapter 4, we learned a basic truth about ourselves. We heard of the warring desires that battle within us. These desires battle against Spirit-led, godly desires. Spirit-led desires are designed to lead us towards God, towards godly desires, towards God's greater glory. But these warring desires, they divert us. They get us off track. They lead us away from God and towards self-desires and towards self's greater glory. Now, that's the general principle that we learned. And what we've then learned the past couple of weeks, I think, are just specific applications of that general principle. How this battle plays out takes many different forms. 2 weeks ago, it was about fights and quarrels. Last week, it was about slander. It was about speaking against one another. And this week is simply just another outworking of these battling desires within us. But it's in the specifics that James makes these rich connections to our lives. Quarreling, slandering are temptations that we face on a regular basis. And so in the same way today, I believe that this is included here in the Bible because of its relevance to our lives. So let's take a look and see exactly what's going on. Now, as we begin in verse 13, it's very clear by the tone of what James has to say that something is wrong, something is bad here. But when we first take a surface level, here things don't seem quite so bad. A number of weeks ago, I sat down with my 11-year-old son and told him that I was going to be giving this talk. I'd known about this for a couple of months. And we got to talking, and I mentioned that that this was about going someplace, and it's about spending time, and about engaging in productive activity, and then making money. And his response was, well, that didn't seem all that bad. What's going on here? And but what we've learned from James so far is that the key is not at the surface level, but we need to get a level lower than that. We need to get to the level of motives and desires. Same thing today. We need to go a level deeper to see what's really going on, what James is speaking against. And I think first of all, it's going to be helpful to, part of this has to do with, we read this through the eyes of a 21st century person. We live our lives today, and there's a context that I think we need to think about a little bit more clearly. Try to think about this through the eyes of the first century person. And so we'll do that. And I think it's not much of a stretch to say that up until about 200 years ago, starvation was a possibility not very far removed from the vast majority of the people that lived at any place and at any time, again up until about 200 years ago. The majority of people would have been farmers or others directly related to agriculture. So if the rains don't come, you may be just a season away from starvation. In addition, they faced a number of other perils, disease, insects, on and on. A number of other perils that we're not as exposed to today. These would have been much more real, much more devastating potentially to those people. So a vast majority of people would have lived in very humble conditions. What would it have looked like? Well, just subsistence living, food for today, never accumulating much to speak of at all, without the variety of foods and goods that we have, without any of the social safety nets that we have. The good life for them would have consisted of regular food, shelter, clothes, that's it. Pretty humble existence compared to what we have the opportunity to enjoy today. But pretty quickly, we can see that these are not the people that James is addressing in verses 13. The people James is addressing are merchants. We might call them business people or entrepreneurs. Now, the skills that a person back then would have needed to be successful are some of the same things that people would need today. To be a successful, what it describes here, going out, going far away, and in an effort to make money, what they would have needed is first of all, an idea. and then a business plan. They need to have a product or a service, and they need to hook that up with some market, someplace, and result in a profit potential. You need a plan. How are you going to get these things together? How are you going to get product to market? You need to know your capabilities. You need to know your product, the competition. You need to have contingency plans. What happens if plan A fails? What do I do next? You need to have connections. The people you know. You need to have people that can make things happen, that can get you out of trouble. You need to have people that can set you up with other people that you need to know. In short, you need people that can help you get to where you want to go. You need money to be able to do what's described here in verses 13 through 17. You don't just go out and do it. You need money to make money. Same thing today. And on top of all that, you need a sense of adventure, sort of the spirit of a gambler. Having planned, having done all your homework, having done everything, you still need to jump out and go do this. You need to have a willingness to take a chance where other people may not. You need to have confidence in yourself, your plans, your abilities, and then go out and do that. So I think we can see a couple of things right away with these people, is that there are plenty of opportunities for pride in all the wrong things. In our abilities, in money, in our ability to plan, in our ability to think through, and on and on and on. There is just more than enough opportunity to be prideful in all the wrong things. So, what do we learn from all this? Number one is that these people have a great deal of certainty about all of this, a degree of certainty, a degree of self-sufficiency, and far more than they really should have. And they know better. They know better than to think that way too. There's a great potential for wrong motives, pride in the wrong things, and importantly, these statements in chapter 4 would have stood in stark contrast to the reality that people would have faced back at that time. For most everyone at that time, it would have been enough just to have food that day. And here are people that are out for a lot more. And it's clear, if you're going to do this, if you're going to go away for a year and go far away, that you're not doing this simply to scrape by and have food for another day. You're out to make a lot of money. And so this would have just been this would have been shocking to the rest of the people of that day. So what's James' response to this? First of all, we see that it may not be what we anticipate. It's not against money, first of all. And he doesn't directly talk about their plans, but his response is, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. So don't be so sure of yourselves. And then number 2, you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Life is short. So don't be so sure of yourself, and life is short. We heard something like this before in James at the beginning, chapter 1. James was speaking about the rich at that point. The rich will pass away like a wildflower, and the rich man will fade away even while he goes about his business. So this is not new. Now, James may also have had in mind Psalm 107 that we heard during our worship time. And that psalm is about the wonderful things, praising God for the wonderful things that He's done. And in that is a section about the dangers of travel on the sea. And the merchants would have known about that, and James would have known about that. Anyone who traveled on the sea at that time was not guaranteed of reaching their intended destination. Sea travel was dangerous. But James is not making this point simply to be philosophical. He's not making these statements just merely to give us pause for thought. Thank you, James. Thank you for this reminder that life is short and I can't control tomorrow. I've been so busy lately that it's nice to stop and consider your words. So yes, life is short and I'll keep that in mind. No, James is not doing that. He's trying to get at something far more serious, far more important. He's trying to instruct us. So what is he trying to teach us? What is he trying to get done in these verses? Well, I think there are three things that he is doing. Number one, he is exposing. He is exposing things. Through the tone, we can hear pretty clearly that he's using very harsh language. He says, guys, this is serious. You need to pay attention. He is exposing the self-deception. Don't be so sure of yourself. You guys are fooling yourself if you think that you really have this much control over time. What is he saying? You're thinking that you can control the years while you can't even control a day. And they are also deceived. And James is reminding them that life is not that long. He's also exposing what's really going on. He's exposing the warring desires that this is just another example of warring desires working themselves out in different parts of our lives. This is the specific application. In this time, these warring desires are working their way out by people exerting our will over our time. And really, that's a deception right there. It's not really our time. It's the time that God has given us. He's exposing what we're doing here, and we talked about this last week. This is another application again. But we're doing and taking what are God's to do and God's to own. These people are trying to orchestrate events using abilities and efforts to try to affect the outcome of future events. That's God's job. With the aim of self-glorification. James calls it boasting. Well, what is boasting? Boasting is self-praise. Boasting is speaking of yourself in superlatives. Or boasting is proclaiming the reasons for one's own pride. So what they're doing is trying to affect future events toward an outcome that will favor themselves. And James is saying this is so out of character with the life that they're supposed to be living. A little example. Well, first of all, from commentaries, a lot of the commentators suggest that there's a good chance that the people that James is describing here in verses 13 through 17 are members of the church, are Christians. And again, this is so out of character with what the life they're supposed to be living. Presumably they started out well, but things haven't gone well since that time. Reminds us of in 1 John chapter 2, where it says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lusts of the eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires will pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever." So clearly, these actions are not from God. What is James doing in these verses? He's exposing. James is also warning us. James may have had in mind a parable that his brother Jesus gave in Luke chapter 12. And there, Jesus is talking to a group of people, and out of the blue, someone shouts out, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus responds, telling people to watch out for all sorts of greed, and then he tells this parable about the ground of a certain rich man producing a good crop. And the man thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." And he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and goods. And I will say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God's response to him, God's response to this rich person was, "You fool, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" The man was a fool for two reasons. First of all, the obvious one is that he lived a life directed towards self, a self-serving life. But he also makes a second mistake, and that is that he has turned his back on a means of God's grace. He has turned his back on something that God has given him, which is his life, his time on earth. This man had effectively planned his life to such an extent that God was no longer a part of it and could not be a part of it. God is nowhere. This man in this man's way of thinking, he had achieved ultimate success. He had played out this game of life in his mind, and he wins. And from a purely human viewpoint, this would have been quite an accomplishment to be set like that for the rest of your life. The problem is that he was playing the wrong game. He's living a life with the wrong objectives. So there are two warnings from James here. One is that there is a God to whom we will one day give an accounting for how we've lived our lives. There is a God, and one day we will stand before him and give an account for what we've done. And also, there's a warning for the people in James chapter 4 and also for us is to not turn our back on this form of grace. During our lives, by God's will and by God's working, God will bring salvation to people. So to take our time that we have and to so make our plans without God that we build God out of our lives is just foolishness. Now, yes, God can and does act even in the hearts of the most stubborn people, of the most closed-hearted people, but that's not a position that we want to put ourselves in. Okay, well, what is James doing? He is exposing and he is warning us, but James is also doing something else, and this is not all just about correction, and this is not all about harsh words that he has. This is not so obvious, but James is also dispensing grace. James is dispensing grace in these verses. Despite the situation, God is less visibly, but no less deliberately, about the business of dispensing grace. And to see this, it's helpful to look at another biblical example in Psalm 2. In Psalm 2, which is a messianic psalm, where it starts out that God has established his Son as ruler with dominion over all the earth. But it's not just about that. There are rulers and kings of the earth, and they don't like it. They don't like it that God has established his rule over their lives, and they want to do something about it. So their way of thinking and their reality is that if we just band together in opposition to God's rule, then we can overthrow him, and we'll be on our own. God laughs at their efforts. The people's reality, which is no reality at all, is foolishness to God. The true reality is that God has decreed his rule. It's not open for discussion, and nothing can thwart his efforts. Now, given that situation, the last verses of Psalm 2 has words of grace for these people, for these kings and rulers. And his message is, be warned and be wise. What I have decreed will come to pass, and opposition will not go well for you. So what you need to do is adopt the true reality. Your actions should then be to serve the Lord. Put yourself in submission to the true authority, His Son. And the very last line of that psalm is a wonderful line, which is, blessed are all those who take refuge in Him, including the kings and the rulers. So there's grace in Psalm 2. God is providing an alternative, a course of action, a position to be in where things will go well. And the same is true in James chapter 4. James is already, where's the grace in James chapter 4? Well, James has caught our attention already. He's pointing out in very strong terms that you guys need to wake up. He's exposing what's going on. We find also that God is redirecting our steps here. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, which is having a heartfelt desire to acknowledge God's sovereignty in your lives. And we learned also another form of grace at the beginning of chapter 4. The key to that is humbleness, having a humbleness before God. So there is grace also in James chapter 4. Well then, quickly, how should we plan? How should we plan our lives? And I guess the first question is should we plan our lives? Given everything that we've read now in verses 13 through 17, is planning wrong? And the answer is no, that plans are not wrong, as we talked about in the last couple of weeks. Often, it's not the object of our desire that's wrong in itself, but the intensity of the desire. And that's the case today. There's nothing wrong with planning. There's lots of biblical support. And also, if you think about it, you can go to the other extreme, and which is not a good position to be in. We can have the attitude that, well, it really doesn't matter what we do, or what we plan, that God is great and God's great will be done despite what I might do, and that may cause us to sit on the sidelines and not act. That's not a position where we should be. We aren't passive spectators. God wants us to be active participants. So then how should we plan? Well, I'd like to suggest a Proverbs 16:3 example. The Proverbs 16:3 example of how we should plan our lives. And that states, commit to the Lord whatever you do, and your plans will succeed. Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and your plans will succeed. I think James would first have us examine our motives. What's really in our hearts that are causing us to plan one way or another? Is it bitter envy, selfish ambition, or is it more godly motives? I think James would have us make use of the resources, our intellect, our ability to plan. James would have us use that. But always having our plans subject to God's greater will. A willingness to regularly review plans against the standard of God's will. A willingness to change plans if needed. A couple of ways not to do this. Won't spend much time, but in 1 Samuel 15 is an example of how not to plan. And in that case, King Saul disobeyed commands that were given to him on battling peoples, and he substantially obeyed. He did pretty much everything he was supposed to, but not completely. And Samuel's response to that was that it's better to obey than sacrifice. And we might imagine the merchants in James chapter 4 responding to this by saying, well, yeah, we have all these plans for our lives, but that's half the story. You need to understand that we intend to tithe once we get this money and become wealthy. That's part of the story too. But these two approaches really sidestep the issue. See, we can't just try to conform our plans to our view of what God's purposes are. The key issue is ownership. And in these examples right here, people are still in control of their plans. And what God would have us do instead is have God's ownership and God's sovereignty over these plans. So how does this apply to our lives today on May 5th in Kenosha? What do we do? I think we can see very easily that this can go